In earlier two lectures, we've already looked at two possible ways of classifying contracts. Number one was on the basis of formation and number two was on the basis of enforceability. Now in this lecture, we're going to consider another classification, that is classifying contracts on the basis of performance. The very first thing to notice is that when we classify contracts according to performance, there are further two categories to consider. Number one is executed contract and number two is executory contract. I repeat, when we are classifying contracts on the basis of performance, there are further two subcategories to be considered. Number one is executed contracts and number two is executory contracts. And as far as executory contracts are concerned, there is a further subdivision between two types, that is unilateral contracts and bilateral contracts. In this short lecture, I am only going to be discussing the difference between executed and executory contracts. And in another lecture, I am going to be discussing the difference between unilateral and bilateral contracts, which is basically a subcategory of executory contracts. So an executed contract is simply a contract where both of the parties have already performed their respective promises. It's literally as simple as that. So for instance, a bookseller sells a book on cash payment, and this is an example of an executed contract because both of the parties have done what they were supposed to do under the contract. On the other hand, we have executory contracts, which is basically a contract in which something remains to be done by either one or both of the parties, depending on whether it's a unilateral contract or a bilateral contract. And the meaning of an executory contract will be better understood once you look at the difference between unilateral and bilateral contract in the next lecture.